Hitting revenue targets is hard and requires constant hustle. Last quarter's success is already forgotten. Learn the mindset and tactics of today's most successful revenue producers in B2B marketing and sales. We call this the revenue hustle. I'm your host, Tom Hessen, navigating you on this journey. Today's show is sponsored by 9 Lenses, an interactive assessment platform that enables you to add instant value to your buyers and allows your sales team to tailor business conversations focused on the pain points each and every time. Check them out at 9lenses.com.
All right, this is your host, Tom Hessen of the Revenue Hustle podcast, and we're back with another exciting episode with a very interesting sales leader, Ruchir Nath of Dell. Welcome to the Revenue Hustle.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for having me here. I'm super excited to be on your show.
Yeah, we've had some great conversations leading up to our discussion today. So you are the Director of Global Sales Strategy and Operations at Dell. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I've been at Dell 9 years. I've done a variety of roles within the sales operations world, and I've also been in corporate finance. Before Dell, I worked at AMD for 3 years. So, even there, I did multiple roles within finance. I have a master's. I did my MBA from the US, and I have a bachelor's in engineering.
Wow. So yes, the unique blend of finance, business, and sales all coming together, which makes a lot of sense of the types of jobs that we're going to talk about and the roles that you've been in. So you know how we do this with revenue rules. So Ruchir, why don't you give us your first revenue rule?
Sure, Tom. Look, my first revenue rule is fight the problem, not the people. And why did this rule came to my mind is because I have made some errors and I have had learnings in my life, right? So the rule that I gave you comes from exactly what I've learned through my experience. And I'm also guilty of making this error, right? And why it's important is every time you're trying to grow a business, you have to look at the problem that you are trying to solve. And because we work in big corporations and teams where we are involved with people, more often than not, we try to focus more on the people than the problem at hand, right? And that's why this rule.
Yeah, and what's been interesting as you've been dropped into a number of, I'll call it kind of fixer roles, where there's, for whatever reason, the sales performance isn't what it was expected. And so you're often fighting problems. And so tell us a little bit about how did you kind of figure this out, right? Because again, maybe it starts with you being dropped into these fixer roles. So tell us a little bit about the background, how you got into these roles, and then what's it like when you're dropped in, right, from the group that you're a part of?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, first thing is when you're working with a lot of smart people, right, you have to be performing at a certain level, right, and build the credibility and trust, right? I think I was fortunate enough to work with great people around me. And so, I was offered certain opportunities, which, you don't get very often in life, right? And I think because of the trust and the credibility I was able to build over a period of time, I have been dropped into some of these situations where I had to go solve together with the team, some of the most pressing issues at hand, right? And to your second question on how did I do that, right? The first thing is, you are usually given an outline of what the problem is. It's usually super high level, right? Something very easy to understand and chew on. But the next step that you do is when you get into these roles, there are a lot of people who are involved and who are SMEs at their job, right? And so the first step you do is you really have to identify the problem and get to the depth of it, right? And to do that, you have to talk to as many people who are involved as possible, right? And really listen to them, right? Because when you move from top to down in the chain of command, the same problem has different meanings at every level, right?
Right.
So to really understand what that problem is, you have to talk to everybody and really listen, and find the doers, right? Like people who are really doing the job and, are in the forefront of it, right? So that's how I would identify the problem. And of course, I can talk more about it, based on, how do I get to the end of it? But I'll wait for you if you have any more follow-ups there.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting too is so someone identifies a sales underperformance problem,
Correct.
right? And there's a number of hypotheses, but that's not your, you're part of a team that gets dropped in to help,
Correct.
right? So there's a leadership team, a group of people that are not meeting the target. So here comes Ruchir being parachuted in, right? What's that like being, the person that's being asked to go fix the problem with the leadership team that couldn't fix it themselves, right? Because I think by nature, there's a little bit of a, I don't want this guy coming in here, right? Like I can figure this out myself, or maybe we don't even see the problem, right? And so you kind of are an adversary from the outset. Just again, from the 50,000 foot view, that may not be true, but like just the way it's set up, is kind of like unwelcomed help. That have you experienced that, and kind of how do you navigate the people dynamic, right? Kind of going back to the revenue rule, you got to fight the problem, not the people. It's easy from the get-go to not be, maybe some of, you may not be welcomed, right? So how do you kind of overcome all of that?
Correct. So look, most of my experience, it has been more favorable where people would have been more welcoming. But yes, there have been cases, to your point, where that wasn't the case, at least in the outset, right? When I joined, right? So the first thing you do is, you want to meet all the stakeholders, the critical people who are involved, and really explain them why you are here, right? You are here to help them versus the other way around, right? And you talk to them, you understand their pain point. It's not most of the times, it's like they all understand what the problem is. It's just that the organization is too complex, and leaders especially don't have enough time to go talk to everyone, right? And go solve it for themselves. And that's where people like me come in, which are kind of the grease between the gears, right? So my job is to go talk to the folks, get them on board, right? And get the emotions out of the problem, right? It's more about being focused on the facts, as we say it, right? Do the fact finding, put it on a piece of paper in terms of options and recommendations, right? And then just drive the alignment, right? But most of the times it's about winning their trust and being on their side and telling them, how I can come in and help them be more successful, right? Because at the end of the day, everybody who's working wants to grow, right? And be successful. And I think if you are able to drive that message tops down, right, it's easier, but it takes time, right? You have to be on it consistently. It doesn't happen, in 2 meetings. You have to work on it.
Right. And so what is the typical duration of like a fix it sort of role, right? So is that a couple of weeks? Is it 6 months? And how much time does it take to kind of get up and ramped and kind of get that alignment that you were just talking about, where you are a trusted partner, not a unwelcomed foe?
Great question. So look, in my experience, I've done, I've been into places where certain projects can take an year, right? Because they're just a lot more complicated. It pretty much touches from, sales, IT, operations, and so on and so forth. Like, for example, one of the things that we are doing, or have done is like transformation of, how do we run the business, right? Not more from a seller perspective, but how do we make our leaders look at the business more efficiently, more fast, right? And get to a decision a lot faster, right? So that involves multiple teams, and that can take about a year or two. I've been in projects, where we implemented certain things and it wasn't going our way, and then you just go in and you are given a time of 6 months to quickly figure out a problem, and then it impacts you. Take it piecemeal, right? As you say, okay, in the first 6 months, this is where I'm going to focus on, right? We're going to solve this problem, and then we'll come to the next problem in the next 6 months. So it actually depends. Most of them have been anywhere from a year to 6 months, and then it just basically we keep iterating and fixing those as we learn. Some things work, some things don't work, right? And then you iteratively just keep going and fixing them. But then that's towards the end of the project. But in the middle, you have to really define the problem and break it into smaller chunks.
Yeah, and so like what are some examples of some of the problems that you've been asked to solve? Again, you don't need to get a lot of detail, but is it um, maybe like revenue performance wasn't there or a certain product wasn't selling as much as you anticipated? Like just kind of describe like some of the scenarios that you've been asked to solve or dig
Sure.
into.
So yeah, so the first two scenarios that you talked about, we have worked on, like our teams have worked on both of them, right? Once there was a situation where we made certain changes um, on the field side, and we saw a drop in the performance, right? I won't say drop in the performance, but the revenue growth didn't happen, right? Because I guess we all have smart people across all the companies, right? So there's no question about talent as such, right? But I think some of the changes were were big, and a lot of time what happens, Tom, in the real world is when you're trying to solve a problem, right? We just don't get enough time to think through the second order and third order impact of when you're coming
Right.
up with a solution, right? Which is uh, something that all of us, pretty much in every corporation, we tend to miss, right? So when we get a problem, or when a problem was solved, we only thought through the first order and we went ahead and went live with it. And then suddenly, the second order problem and third order problem that we didn't think through start coming in, right? So what we do in that case is we basically figure out, okay, whether the changes that we made were they too drastic, right? Did we really move or churn a lot of people, right? Put them in a position which is not on to their strengths. As an example, when you're talking to people, right? For example, what accounts did they get assigned to? Is it now more efficient for them to go drive it or not? So that kind of a problem. And then when you look at it, you come up with solution. And essentially, when the problem happens, most often than not, you are now fixing the second and third order issues, a problem that you didn't think through in the first place, right? So that's number one, right? To your question, solving that people issue, not people issue, but the go-to-market issue as such, if I were to say it right in our sales terminology. The second one is related to product. And look, all of us in the industry, we have really strong competitions across the board, right? And we are always consistently, especially given I come from the technology background and I'm in the technology industry, product means everything to you. It's pretty much cutting edge products, right? And when you have product, and when we are working with our sellers and they come back and give us feedback that, we are running into certain issues because, let's say, you know the products aren't doing well, or they're not as competitively priced. They might be really good, but they may not be competitively priced. So we keep hearing it, right? We try to have big ears, right? And then what we do is, of course, you have to, everything that you hear, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, right? So in that case, we sit down with our product teams, we figure out whether that is a legit issue or not, right? And then we basically, what we try to do is, look, the product usually takes time to go. Let's say we missed uh, a feature, right? Now it's going to take some time, but then what do we do? Like, then do we change
Right.
our audience, as in, like, who do we position this product for, right? It may not be worthy enough now to be selling it to certain customers, but we can pivot it to certain customers who benefit out of it, right? So we try to be nimble and guide our sales team to sell where it would still make us money, right? And then work with the product team to fix certain issues if there are any. And once we go live with those, then we repivot them to go sell, right? So it's about effectively managing the problem that you have at your hand and figuring out
Right.
those areas of opportunities to go drive your sales to basically sell those products in that places.
Right. And I think what's interesting is that you have a very similar process, right? Where you really just have to go and spend a lot of time to understand what the real problem is, right? Because I think it's probably lazy in some cases just to say, oh, our salespeople aren't any good, or we don't have the right materials from marketing. Like there's some probably common complaints between sales or marketing people or leadership to kind of point to that without a lot of, maybe it's anecdotal, right? Maybe there's a hint of truth, like you said, to something along those lines. But to your point, there's probably a lot of complexity, second and third order problems that aren't floating to the top, right? And again, given the size of your sales teams, it's hard to kind of collect that feedback given all the conversations that are happening out there. So it becomes a very difficult thing just to understand what the true problem is. And would you say, like, there may not be someone's job to figure that out until it becomes a problem? Like, how can you avoid that? Because you're now being brought in as kind of like the fixer, right? And you're given all the time in the world to go troubleshoot this problem. Had you not been there, whose job is it to kind of triage this? And maybe that's part of the problem, that there is no one single person in marketing or sales ops, et cetera, to kind of figure that out.
Yeah, look, that is actually correct, right? Usually, we have, to your first point, right? I would keep saying this, in Fortune 500 company or in companies, otherwise, there are a lot of smart people across the board, right?
Yeah.
So that has never been a problem, right? That's usually never a problem. But yes, because the organizations are so matrixed, and by the virtue of how we operate in big organizations, right? We are an SME at the stuff that we do, right? And so we know that problem in and out. But I think what becomes very critical, Tom, and I think that is where probably I have done fairly well, or I was lucky to learn it earlier in my career, is how do you connect all those dots, right?
Yeah.
It's not easy, and it's not something that can be taught to you. You have to do it to really learn it, right? So for example, what do I mean by that, to your question, right? The marketing team is doing really the best they can, as an example, to come up with the marketing communications on the products or whatever it might be, right? But the fact is, they may not be talking enough with the sales, right? They would be, right? But they may not be hearing it, right? Because they feel what they're doing is right, but the sales is giving a different feedback. And because they all work and operate with each other so much, there's a general tendency of having a friction that comes up. And that's what I said, right? Don't focus on the people. And when someone like me is dropped in, I'm not coming in with that baggage, right? So it actually works to my
Right.
advantage,
Yeah.
right? Because, when I'm going and talking to the sales team, as an example, right? They can be pretty open about what they don't like from the operations team or the marketing team, right? And when I go and talk to the marketing team, they don't see me as a champion for sales, as an example. They really discuss and tell me what they feel about why this problem is there and why it's not working, right? So as I said, right, I think it works to my advantage more than to my disadvantage in a lot of these places, where, because I'm coming from a very set, or a pair of eyes that is basically not indoctrinated in that
Right.
vertical, right? And so they are more open to discuss issues with me in a lot of cases than they are to discuss that in a meeting with the same people over and over again and again, right? So I think that is where where the opportunity lies is. And that's why I think a lot of people and companies do it. They set up these small tiger teams to go solve these problems, because that ends up being more efficient and effective.
Yes. No, that's really, that's a really good point. You are kind of an independent, neutral party, right? You're Switzerland, and you can help get these teams to see things differently, right? There's probably a lot of truth in what each one's saying, but they're just maybe talking past each other. So you're able to filter that. So let's just end this revenue rule. So if there's always a lot of organizations out there are wishing their sales performance was higher, right? Or there's missed expectations or missed quotas and so on. So like, what would you advise, a growth leader, right, to run a process to truly get to the bottom, of what the cause is? Because generally speaking, I think everyone has a gut feel, but it may not always be right. So like, how would you advise them on running a process to kind of fix it?
Yeah, look, the first thing I would say is have an open mindset, right? I think a lot of us talk about it, but it's very hard to do actually in a fast-paced environment, right? So for example, if I'm a sales leader, I would have a tendency to listen to my team, right? I would trust them, and whatever they tell me, I'm going to take the same thing and go tell the other counterpart or the stakeholders, right? Now they would have the same, thing that they would be thinking, hey, look, we are doing everything right, it's you, right? And so, thinking big and having the growth mindset and, have big ears is important, right? So you listen to your team, but at the same time, be very open to what others have to say, right? And start looking at things a little more objectively. And as I said, focus on the problem, right? The problem is to get your sales team back to growth. And that basically drives to my second point is you have to align everybody in the chain and everybody across the stakeholder on a vision, right?
Mm.
Which sounds easy, but is very, very difficult to do unless everybody understands what the end goal is and that we are in this together. Chances are you will never be successful as an organization or as a leader. So those would be the two things I would say. And then, of course, there are other things, but we'll talk about it because it's going to be my second rule for you.
All right. Well, I think that's a great transition. I couldn't have timed that any better. So, great discussion on solving sales problems. I mean, I think we spent a lot of time there because I think there's always something not firing on all cylinders, right, within a go-to-market motion for a number of reasons, which are always hard to discern. So really interesting. But why don't you go ahead, give us your second revenue rule?
Yeah, look, my second revenue rule ties to my first one, which is basically you need to have that operational excellence and cadence, which actually dictates your growth or return on investment. And what it means essentially is in a high speed, highly complex and matrixed organization, if you don't drive effectiveness, and that also answers the question that you said, hey, look, does it usually take you 1 year or does it take you usually 6 years? If you have good, strong processes, efficient processes in place, and you hammer them out, you can actually solve a problem which would have taken you a year. You could probably do it in 8 months or 6 months with more effectiveness and with probably lesser number of people. And so for every money you spend towards your team, you end up getting a higher revenue growth for your company and makes you more profitable at the same time.
Right. And I think I think Dell's well known for their operational effectiveness. And I think that probably comes from just the industry that you're in, where from the products, the computers, the servers, right? Like there is a ton of operational effectiveness, efficiency, mastery, right? Just to stamp out every fraction of margin in the production, in the supply chain, the time to market, right? So you have to think very, like you said, hammer out, like it's like a manufacturing system, right? You're pounding out these machines, which I'm guessing just carries forward into the other parts of the organization, right? Like, do you recognize that is that even true, right? Like this operational excellence is maybe because of you had to do that in your product, right? And it just kind of carries forward.
You bring up a really good point, Tom. No, that's actually very true, right? Operational excellence would actually depend on the industry that you are in, right? For example, if you talk about, let's say, I'm a big fan of Costco, right? They do about 240 billion in revenue and their operating income is probably closer to 7 billion, right? So now for them, operational excellence would mean talking in terms of cents and driving the maximum efficiencies they can find through their process, right? Be it their supply chain, how they're going to stack it in their, Costco showrooms or shops, and then how much revenue they're making from per square footage of, the area that they have per employee. Like that is operational excellence for them, right? But if you look at industries which are growing, right? Let's say a software company like Microsoft, or you talk about cloud, growth, they would be more focused on driving the growth, right? But once a market matures enough, they will have to start focusing on operational excellence, right? Let's say when 3 big players have almost 30% of the market, and the market share is now to gain every percentage point of market share, the only way you can do it is through driving operational excellence, right? And so from industry to industry, it would definitely change. And I think I should say this on your podcast is one of the things I have learned is if you change jobs or if you do anything, you really have to understand what industry you are in, right? And how those dynamics really play around in that industry. And that would make you a very effective leader to be able to drive growth for your business and at the same time drive profitability.
Right. Because you probably can't take if I took you out of Dell and you got dropped into a software company, right? It would probably be a bit of a operational excellence shock, right? In a way that it operates probably very differently, right? And so your point is you have to take into account, right, what the industry, what does excellence look like, right? But a lot of times people are missing that, right? So like your expectation, you know, if you were to try to lead a software company as an example, like you would do it at Dell, it probably wouldn't go very well.
Correct. And let me give you an example, right? I may not know everything about the SaaS business, right? But look at it, right? The KPIs that we track at a company like Dell is going to be very different than the KPIs that they might be tracking in the software industry, right? It's revenue per customer, right? How many active users do you have, right? What's the churn rate? What's the retention rate, right? And these can be very different compared to the industry that we are in. Some of them might be similar, right? But then the way the KPIs and how you are executing your business at the top would define the operational excellence at the bottom, right? Or through the company.
Right. And how did you kind of realize this? I mean, because you've been in Dell and I think AMD too, right? If I remember, right? So you've been kind of in these, you know, product-based, heavy manufacturing businesses. So
yeah. So I think two things helped me. First of all is, you know, before coming to the US, I worked in IT consulting. And so I had banks as my clients and energy customers as my clients. So even though I was very young to understand this back then, but when I reflected back on it, you know, comparing it to the experience I had after my MBA, I realized all these different industries actually operated in a very different way. And the second thing that helped me is, and I have gotten more wise about it over the last couple of years, is I tend to read a lot, as much as I can, about varying topics. And that has helped me. Like, it can be different industries, it can be just a random topic that I would like to know about. And at that point in time, you don't really realize, you know, you just learn and it's just one vertical, you covered one topic. But the more you keep reading, I think you are able to just connect the dots better, right? So for example, on Costco, I actually ended up reading their 10K couple of months back because their stock was doing really well. Now, why would I do that? I mean, there's no reason for me to read a Costco 10K, to be honest. It's just that I was curious because, you know, their stock price had been climbing and I wanted to really know how they are doing it differently than Walmart. And, you know, once you read more, you just connect the dots, I guess.
Well, I will tell you, I read this the other day. It's on my to-do list. There is a podcast that is the most popular podcast for business executives called Acquired. And I haven't listened to an episode yet. Have you heard about this?
I have, and I've actually finished 3 of their episodes.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Correct.
Okay, which episodes?
So the first one I heard was on Microsoft. The second one that I finished was on Costco, right? After I had read my 10K and I ended up listening to that podcast too. It was amazing. And the one that I'm going through right now is NVIDIA. They actually interviewed Henson, and I actually started it yesterday. I'm almost 30 minutes into it.
Okay, well, I'm not surprised, and just given the level of detail that is discussed, right, it kind of speaks right into your operational excellence, right? Because they really pick apart these businesses. So that's what made me think of you as you were talking about that. But no, that's fascinating. I mean, I think it's easy to forget what good looks like, what dictates good, right, in terms of operational excellence and what we can strive for. So two rich conversations here, one with fixing problems and one is driving excellence, two things that you've done very well with Dell. So tell us a little bit about how you got into your role.
How did I got into my role? That's a great question. I didn't plan for it, Tom, to be honest, if that's what you were thinking, right? So, I've been in corporate finance and I've done that for, 4 or 5 years. And I was itching to do something new. Okay. So I started networking around at Dell and, I networked and talked to different teams. And then my leader back in the day actually ended up hiring me for this sales ops role. I had no clue what sales ops really meant, right? And I think I got lucky there. I just wanted to move outside of finance, and I ended up being in a team of really, really smart people and caring people, right? And then just one thing led to another, right? I just focused as I said, focused on fixing problems. I think that comes naturally to me a little bit, and a little bit is what I have learned over a period of time. And then one thing led to another. And then soon I realized that, there are things that I'm good at, right? There are strengths that I have, which I didn't realize I had before. And then I guess leaders were kind enough to see that and, bestow those good opportunities to me and, back me, right? I'll be very honest in saying this to you and on your podcast. A lot of times we feel we did everything on our own. That's usually not the case. You need a lot of help throughout your life,
right?
Both at work and anywhere else, right? You don't realize it, but if you really think about it, certain things happened in certain moments. Certain people took bet on you, even though you may not have been the most qualified there, right? And so those things you really don't control, right? So I just ended up being here. I didn't plan it that I would do this for 3 years, then I would do this for 5 years, and I haven't planned any of it, honestly. It just happened.
Well, yeah, and I think it feels like it just happened, but you're really wired for it, right? And I think that's where people sometimes I think it's hardest to see ourselves, right? What we're good at, what our skills are, our natural abilities, and oftentimes young in your career, you don't have a lot of exposure into other roles and problems to even know that that's something you would be interested in, especially in a large organization. There's lots and lots of different roles and opportunities. So I'm not surprised you are doing well where you are. Thanks for coming on. Tell us where we can follow you online.
I actually don't have a lot of online presence, but I am only on LinkedIn. I am on no other social media. Fortunately or unfortunately, depends on how people see it. So you can find me at, if you search for Ruchir Nath on LinkedIn, you'll find me there. And that's the only social platform that I am on. Okay.
Well, easy to find you then. Well, Ruchir, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been a great conversation. I've got a book of notes here that I'm going to take away, especially around the fixing part, right? Because I think everybody can optimize or seek to optimize. So I think this will be really popular. But thanks again for coming on. Let's do it again soon.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you for tuning in to The Revenue Hustle. This episode has been brought to you by 9 Lenses. Close more deals with interactive assessments. Check them out at 9lenses.com. See you next time.